John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and former national security advisor during Donald Trump's first presidential term, is with us from Washington, D.C. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for accepting our invitation. I don't recall ever seeing such a conversation and dispute in the White House with a foreign leader. What is your reaction to this encounter between Mr. Trump and Zelensky?
I have never seen anything like what has just happened in the Oval Office. I think it's a catastrophe for the United States, for Ukraine, for Europe, for the free world. Trump and Vance have come down on the side of Russia unequivocally. And I think it will have extremely adverse consequences for the United States and its alliances and friendships around the world. This is a historical reversal. I think we could see it coming, but now we've seen it in completely unvarnished tones. I think this is a sad moment to see that happen in the Oval Office.
We know that the United States has been a long-standing historical ally of the Europeans against threats like the Russian Federation and, in the past, the former Soviet Union. How much do you think the U.S. is retreating from these commitments? And what will this mean for the world?
Well, let's distinguish who we're talking about here. I don't think the United States is stepping back from anything. I think what has happened is that Vance and Trump have stepped back. They have sided with Russia, America's adversary, against essentially all of our allies in Europe, and against the people of Ukraine, who for 3 years have been fighting off unprovoked Russian aggression. That's why this is such a sad day for the United States and for its alliances around the world. But I want to be very clear here. I do not believe that what Trump and Vance have said in this extraordinary, unprecedented attack on the leader of a friendly state represents anything like the majority opinion of American citizens. I think it's their opinion, and I don't know how this will play out. It's so unprecedented, I don't think anybody can predict. But I think everybody should be clear who owns what just happened in the Oval Office. Trump and Vance own it. The American people do not.
But it doesn't seem that European leaders necessarily see it this way. Right now, we see the new German leader talking about independence from the United States. The French are worried, and the British have similar concerns. How much do you think the paths of Europe and the U.S. might diverge, perhaps aided by the behavior Mr. Trump is exhibiting?
Well, I think people need to keep this in perspective. I understand exactly what Trump and Vance are saying, and I understand why people around the world are worried about it. I'm worried about it too. But history is a long time. It's not just one president. We'll see what happens in the next days politically in the United States. I think Trump has made a huge political mistake from his own perspective here. I think this may be what finally causes Republican members of Congress to stand up and say Trump doesn't represent their opinions. We'll have to see. But I firmly believe that the average American does not want to be on the same side as Russia and North Korea in this conflict.
Let's move a bit away from Europe and go to Iran, where most of our viewers are watching us from. Many believe that with Mr. Trump's second term, maximum pressure against Tehran would resume, and it seems there are whispers of it. Meanwhile, the nuclear agency is saying that Iran is very close to developing nuclear weapons. How do you see the approach of the Trump administration towards Iran, and do you think the measures are sufficient, or should it go beyond this? Should it go further?
Well, maximum pressure in the first term was, I think, the right policy. But I don't think that we enforced our sanctions, especially on the export of oil and other petroleum products, as effectively as we could have. Certainly in the Biden administration, enforcement of the sanctions diminished significantly, and it will be put back in place. But my view on sanctions always was that they were to put pressure on Iran, leading to the overthrow of the regime of the Ayatollahs, because there will not be a legitimate government in Iran until the Islamic revolution is overthrown, and there will certainly not be peace and security in the Middle East until the regime is overthrown. Whether Trump will go through with that or not, I don't know. He didn't favor regime change in the first term, and he has said in the campaign he didn't favor regime change in Iran. I think we're kidding ourselves if we think you can trust anything the Ayatollahs agree to. So I hope the pressure put on by the resumed enforcement of sanctions helps persuade the Iranian people that the time has come to say, we want a new government in Iran.
Many people say that Mr. Trump is not a warlike personality. Perhaps part of his disagreement during his first term with you was also about this foreign policy approach and the extent of using America's power. How much do you think, as you say, the Ayatollahs in Tehran also know this, and might say, all right, we will endure the maximum pressure, but this president is not one to lead America into war?
Well, the question is whether people find American strength to be more threatening, or they find American weakness to be more attractive. I think the perception of weakness will lead the Ayatollahs to further repression inside Iran and further adventurism through the Quds Force and their terrorist proxies internationally, further efforts to get deliverable nuclear weapons, further efforts to support terrorist groups. I think, as Ronald Reagan said, you get peace through strength, not through weakness.
There is another important player that might significantly change the equations, and that is Israel. Do you think it is possible that Israel might take unilateral action against Tehran without Mr. Trump's green light?
Well, I think there's never been a better moment for Israel and the United States to deal with this international problem of nuclear proliferation that the Ayatollahs are posed. This is not just an Israeli issue. It's an issue for everybody in the world who opposes rogue states getting access to nuclear weapons that they can possibly pass on to terrorist groups. I don't think the strike against Iran's nuclear weapons program would harm the people of Iran, but I think it would demonstrate how much of the country's resources they have wasted on the terrorist proxies, ballistic missiles, and nuclear weapons, none of which benefits the people of Iran. That should be a signal, I think, to the people of Iran that it's time to take measures into their own hands and try and persuade leaders in the army, even in the Revolutionary Guard, that it's time to tell the regime that they need to depart.
Mr. Ambassador, and finally, I want to ask a question about your own situation. We know that there have been threats against you and some other members of Mr. Trump's administration from the Islamic Republic, and because of this, you had security guards around you, which Mr. Trump removed. How did you feel when President Trump withdrew this security support from you?
Well, I was not entirely surprised, since when I resigned, he removed it the day that I resigned back then. President Biden put it back on because of the Iranian threats, not just against me, but indeed against Trump himself, former Secretary of State Pompeo, former Secretary of Defense Esper, and others. I think it's a mistake. Obviously, I have a personal interest in it, but it's more of a mistake from the perspective of American national security. If rogue governments like the Ayatollahs think they can threaten former American officials and their own government won't seek to protect them, that's a terrible signal to send to America's adversaries.
Thank you. John Bolton, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and former National Security Advisor to the White House during Donald Trump's first term.